All right. Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. Congrats to the award winners. I am relatively new to this community. I actually attended my first Applied Ergo last year, and I have to say I was immediately impressed. I loved it. It was a really welcoming community, and I learned a lot. In fact, within 24 hours, I was already on social media trying to encourage other academics like myself to attend the conference, to learn from the ergonomics practitioners, the safety leaders, the frontline innovators, and I was really, really thrilled when the conference organizers reached out to me and invited me to come share some perspectives, share some stories, and honestly to share some mistakes I've made related to innovation over the last several years. Rather than start by talking about ergonomics, I want to start by telling you a story about one of the greatest innovations of World War I. Some of you may know pictures like this. This is something called dazzle camouflage, okay? So the year was 1917, and the Allied ships were just getting decimated by German U-boats, by submarines. By this point in the war, there had been over 5,000 ships that were sunk, a combination of naval and merchant vessels, and it was costing a lot of ships, and it was costing a lot of lives. Around that time, a British painter by the name of Norman Wilkinson came up with a really clever invention called dazzle camouflage. But it didn't work the way normal camouflage worked. It didn't actually conceal ships. You see, at the time, there were hundreds of U-boats that were patrolling the waters, and they would spot ships. At the time, they had to look through their periscope, and they would see the ship. They would identify its speed and its heading, and then they would fire or torpedo to intersect with its trajectory. Well, it turns out, if you paint ships these crazy, violent, vibrant colors, it's really hard to pick up the direction and the speed of the ship, and it made it more difficult to actually fire the torpedoes along the correct path. And it was surprisingly effective. The following year, there were far fewer ships that were hit by U-boats, in part because of this dazzle camouflage innovation. The reason I like this, and the reason I think this is such a cool example, is it's a perfect illustration of innovation, which is really the crux of my talk. And what I like here is the innovation was not about the name. They made up the name Dazzle at the time. It was about capabilities. It was about what this could do to address a very real problem of the time. It wasn't about categories. They called it camouflage. That was a terrible name for this. This is the opposite of camouflage, but that didn't matter. The reality is it provided the outcomes. Fewer sunk ships, fewer lost lives. It wasn't about gadgetry. It wasn't about the brand of paint. It was about a solution that could be scaled, and indeed it was scaled and used across ships of all different sizes, naval ships and merchant ships. And it wasn't about hype. It didn't prevent ships from being targeted. It didn't save every single ship, but it helped. And it helped in a counterintuitive way, and so education was a really critical component to explain why this kind of outrageous idea actually worked. So what I hope you take away from the talk today, and it's not just about ergonomics, I think this can apply to any facet of your professional or personal life, is to benefit the most from innovation, focus on capabilities, outcomes, solutions, and education, and to be very blunt, stop bullshitting with names and categories and gadgets and hype. I found this to be very good advice, whether you are trying to develop a new innovation or whether you are someone that's trying to use and implement new innovations. Now, before I jump into the specifics there, 3 things you should know about me. The first is I've spent the last 2 decades studying human movement biomechanics and ergonomics and developing wearable and assistive technologies to try to help augment human performance in 2 general categories. Either they're devices to help people with mobility impairments, with disabilities, so there'd be things like prosthetic limbs to help individuals with limb loss, or developing technologies to try to reduce injuries and augment human performance. The second thing is that I have a number of different affiliations. So I am an engineering professor at Vanderbilt. I am also the chief scientist and co-founder of HeroWear, which is an occupational exoskeleton company. Within both of those roles, I've been co-inventor on a number of patents, some of which have been commercialized. I'm also on the board of a nonprofit called the American Bionics Project, which is trying to get more assistive technologies out of the lab and into the hands of people that can benefit, particularly folks with lower limb disabilities. I'm the chair of the VA Scientific Subcommittee on Rehabilitation, Engineering, Prosthetics, and Orthotics, and I am on the F48 ASTM committee that's developing industry standards for exoskeletons. So in my role, I suppose I'm an engineering nerd, but I also kind of span across both academia and industry throughout my work. And I love working at that intersection and in the translational space. The other thing I love is science communication, so I am thrilled to be here, to be able to speak to this group. I really enjoy in many different platforms, whether it's speaking, written, social media, being able to share and help people understand science and technology. I believe that this information should be accessible, that it should be made publicly available, and truth be told, I really hate BS when it comes to health and safety science. I hate when research is misrepresented, and as a researcher and academic trying to do my part to help share and spread some of those. I will also say in the pictures up here, I have seen the exoskeleton industry go through its own innovation and maturation cycle over the last 20 years, and I have learned a lot of lessons about that process. So I will be using exoskeletons as some examples in this talk, but the talk is much broader than that. It's about innovation, broadly speaking, and particularly innovation as it relates to health and safety. So let's talk about innovation. For me, innovation is more than just coming up with new ideas. That's creativity. But true innovation is about implementing new ideas in a way that has a sustained impact on an individual or on society. Why innovation? I like this quote from former CEO of Nike. Innovation is not about creating for its own sake. It's about creating something better, designing with a purpose, okay? So that purpose can be to address a difficult problem. That purpose can be to create some new capability, some new value that didn't exist before. And ergonomics has seen a lot of innovation over the years. It has benefited from innovation. We all have. Innovation is not a cure-all, but it's a continuous process of improvement. This is a plot of workplace injury rate over the last 50 years, and we've seen significant progress. And there's a lot to be proud of in reducing these injury rates and making work a safer place. But over the last 10 years, there's also a number of injuries, a number of risks that have sort of plateaued. Innovation is one way to try to further reduce this injury rate and hopefully drop it by another order of magnitude over the coming years. Okay, so let's talk about why capabilities and focusing on capabilities is so important and why we should avoid trying to play the name game. Now, I will share with you some of my own mistakes. I realized after several years of being a professor that I was kind of a name guy. I didn't realize it, but if people met me and said, hey, what do you do? I would say, oh, I'm a professor. They would immediately say, oh, what do you teach? And I would say, oh, actually, I don't teach that much. I teach a little bit. I mostly run a research lab. So even the name professor would mislead people in thinking, where is the bulk of my responsibilities and time? So I want to share with you a little story. This was a mistake I made, and it's this idea of focusing on names too much is recurring, but back in about 2019, it really came to a head for me. So I was located in Nashville. That's where Vanderbilt is located. And an hour north of us, there is this Army base, Fort Campbell. The university came up with a really clever idea of, what would happen if we took researchers and students and gave them an opportunity to spend time directly in person with the soldiers at this Army base. By spending time together, by getting to understand each other, could we potentially find some areas where we could leverage the science and technical expertise of the university and leverage the lived experience and military expertise of the soldiers and maybe work on some really innovative, new applied research and development? And so we got the opportunity to go up and spend time with the soldiers at Fort Campbell. And we didn't go up there with problems. We didn't go up there with solutions. We went up there to understand their jobs, to understand their pain points, and to get to know them. One of the first visits was in 2019. We went up and were observing the field artillery. So this is a mobile artillery unit. They are supporting other soldiers on the battlefield, and they have these large howitzer weapon systems. Now these are mobile units, so they have to pull up, they have to set up these large guns, they have to maintain them, they have to move and load and lift and handle the artillery rounds. Every artillery round weighs 50 to 100 pounds. Okay? And so we are there and we're observing this exercise for a couple of hours. And in between, we're talking to the soldiers a little bit, and they're explaining to us the very difficult demands they're under. Again, they're lifting and moving these heavy rounds. For safety purposes, they can't even keep the ammunitions right next to the howitzer, so there's a truck parked off in one area. People are bending in very non-ideal, unergonomic postures. They're wearing heavy body armor, but these are jobs that have to get done, and it's taken a toll on them. And they're telling us, hey, I'm 18, 19, 20 years old, my knees are shot, my back's in pain. We've lost this many folks this month to injuries. Across the entire US Army, there are 460 back overuse injuries diagnosed every single day. So we get to a break, and I approach about a half dozen of these soldiers, and I say, you know, we're seeing the jobs you're doing. Have you considered, or would you be interested in something like a wearable exoskeleton to help relieve some strain off your job? What do you think the response was? Oh, they hated it. They said, hell no. They spent the next 10 minutes telling me all the reasons it was a stupid idea, too heavy, too bulky. We already carry 15, 20 pounds worth of batteries. We don't need this thing. What happens here? By the end of this 10 minutes, I mean, they hated the idea, 100%, unanimous, and I think they despised me a little bit for even bringing it up. So they continue their exercise. We're continuing to watch them again, loading these crates, doing their work. And about an hour later, I have a chance to approach the same group, and I approach them differently. Not with the name, but I explain, you know, again, I'm a researcher. I've spent my whole career studying human movement biomechanics. What if we could co-develop some kind of capability that only weighed 2 pounds, and it integrated with your body armor, and it took 100 pounds of strain off your back? Would you be interested in that capability? Completely different response. Suddenly they were intrigued. They were interested to learn more. And about a year and a half went by, and we actually got an opportunity to partner with the soldiers to go through a user-centric iterative development process to create this capability. And the soldiers, throughout that process, got to provide feedback. At the culmination of this project, we then got to test the soldiers during full-speed operations. And what they found was that this capability, during their jobs, in this case, a soldier unloading ammunition rounds out of the back of this military vehicle, provided some relief, provided some help with the difficult tasks. And it's not just the ammunitions. I focus on the 50 to 100-pound rounds because it's a good example, but they have so many other supplies they have to move. This is a 200-pound generator that they have to move around as a part of their setup. They're out in the field. They don't have automation. This is a task that has to be done. They work together to get the work done, often under very difficult circumstances. And just as importantly, because the soldiers were a part of this, they were able to help design the technology, the capability in a way that didn't interfere with the other tasks. So very dynamic jobs. They have to run, they have to walk, they have to climb in and out of vehicles, they sometimes have to crawl, et cetera. So the end of the university-led phase of this work, we got to test soldiers out in the field using the prototypes. We then got to survey the soldiers afterwards. All the soldiers that tested this in the field, 100% said, hey, if this were made available to me, I would be interested in this capability. Okay? That's the difference between the name, 100% opposition, and the capability, showing people the capability. And to be very clear, this blade cuts both ways. There are innovations where people get really excited by the name, but when they experience the capability, it's the other end of the spectrum. If you're interested more in this topic, I'm not going to talk about the iterative design process or military exosuits. We have published a number of academic papers on this, or come find me afterwards, happy to chat about it. One other thing to mention is last year, the Australian Defence Forces leaned into this technology and started to roll out this capability more broadly. And what I found very interesting is when they announced it, they led with it as a lift kit, focusing on the capability. Even to this day, internally at the university, we might call them exoskeletons and exosuits. Soldiers call these things by many names, suits, harnesses, but it's not about the name. It's really about what's the capability, what's the problem that it's addressing. Okay, let's move on to talk about categories and why you should avoid falling into this trap. I think we all do, I certainly have, and why it really is important to focus on outcomes from any new innovation. How many people remember when Wikipedia was kind of growing and coming online? A number of folks raised their hands. So I was in college at the time. This was 2005, 2007-ish. Wikipedia is starting to burst on the scene. And it wanted to be an online encyclopedia, but nobody really knew what it was. And I was in classes where it was very contentious. In some classes, we were forbidden from using it. Other classes, people thought it was a good idea. Nobody quite knew what category it fit into. It was not a traditional encyclopedia. But the reason it grew, the reason it persisted, is because it provided valuable outcomes to enough people. And I think we're going through this now. We see this with large language models, right? What are these things? What category do they fit into? They're kind of like writing assistants. They're kind of like search engines. They can summarize text. They can do some other things. They don't fit cleanly into any of our pre-existing software or tool categories. And really what people are wrestling with is they're trying to understand under what circumstances can I leverage this new thing to provide useful outcomes. And that's why it's so important to focus on outcomes and not get caught up trying to classify something into pre-existing categories. Moving back to ergonomics, there are all sorts of innovations that are maturing, that are growing up, and for many of them, it's not entirely clear where they fit. Take something like the hierarchy of ergonomic controls, for example. Where do each of these technologies fit into that scheme? Do they fit into that model? So, my entire professional career, I mentioned at the beginning, has really been focused on how do we help people with disabilities, how do we reduce injuries. That's as a researcher, how I would see solutions. That's what I focused on. And so at the time that we started researching occupational ergonomics, started thinking about exoskeletons and exosuits, we were firmly focused on how do we use our laboratory, force sensors, motion sensors, muscle activity sensors, to understand musculoskeletal loading, to understand the risk factors, to understand the ergonomic impacts. How do we model this? How do we think about impacts on different parts of the body? And then taking this out to the field, packaging up all our sensors, and repeating these experiments, but always through that lens of safety and risk reduction. And so at the time, 2017, 2018, 2019, when I was forced to start to classify what is an exoskeleton, it seems so obvious to me that, well, it's a wearable safety device. It's just a next generation of personal protective equipment. It's PPE, clearly. And in retrospect, several years later, I realized I just got it wrong. Right? I fell into that trap of feeling like, oh, it's a new thing and it fits into one category. The reality is it doesn't. It doesn't fit cleanly. Most innovations don't. And what I want to come across, and I want you to hear, is that is fine. That is normal for innovation. You have to accept that. If you want to deal with innovation, accept that it may not fit into your pre-existing categories. For some people, they do consider exoskeletons to be a type of ergonomic intervention, and this has developed over the last several years. I think this field has been moving in a positive way, kind of away from trying to categorize something and more towards a focus on outcomes, especially from longitudinal industry studies. Some of the foundational studies were done by automotive companies like Ford and Toyota, where they looked over 18 to 36 months and saw reductions in number of injuries, workers' compensation costs, number of medical visits. Over the last few years, there have been a number of industry studies. This Safety Tech Accelerator report has a summary of a number of these longitudinal studies looking at impacts on musculoskeletal disorders. I was a part of a team last year that helped aggregate data from over 280,000 hours of warehouse workers who are regularly wearing exosuits and found that injury rates for the back dropped from 10.5 injuries historically down to 0 within that group. And then actually just today, so we're obviously here in Orlando, but there is a material handling conference going on in Chicago right now, and there's a panel, you're actually getting a little preview of this afternoon, where a number of companies are sharing their longitudinal data. So Whole Foods had initially implemented exosuits and tracked injuries over a year, found 100% reduction in strain and sprain injuries, then rolled out exos across additional sites within their distribution network, continue to see evidence of injury reduction. URM is another food distribution company, has also measured, after about a year, reductions in both the incident rate and severity of musculoskeletal injuries. So, as a result of kind of this and other data, there are some companies and some individuals that look at exos as a type of ergonomic intervention or type of ergonomic control. But the point I want to get across is it's still not clear which category they fit into. Some companies are implementing them as engineering control, some are implementing them as administrative controls, some as PPE. There isn't a single correct answer. It depends on your organization. Moreover, it's frankly a little bit presumptuous even to think of exoskeletons just as ergonomic controls. There are some people that look at exoskeletons primarily as tools. And there is industry evidence that in certain jobs with certain exoskeletons, you can boost productivity, you can boost performance, you can improve quality while still helping the well-being of workers. So for some companies, exoskeletons are tools. And there's a number of different academic research studies for different types of exoskeletons that have found similar evidence. And so, again, what I want to communicate is, with any new innovation, it may fit multiple categories. The companies that are most effective and benefiting most from innovations are the ones that are really focused on outcomes. They're measuring outcomes, they're reporting outcomes, they're obsessing over outcomes, and they're not getting into that game of trying to categorize something too soon. They're not looking over and saying, oh, well, that company categorizes it differently, that's a problem. They are saying, hey, if we are getting beneficial outcomes from any new innovation, then you can look at your organization. You can think about your culture, your processes, your policies, your people. How would you integrate it? If it's providing a benefit, where does it integrate? What do you call it? It's fine that it doesn't fit into a category. So to be very explicit, innovations simply do not care about our pre-existing categories. We have to get over it. Focus on outcomes instead. You will be far better off. Okay, let's talk about solutions and let's talk about gadgets. For better or worse, it feels like innovations, the word innovation has somehow gotten tied to the gadget, the device, the app, the cool new thing. And all of the work, all of the things that are needed to actually implement it kind of fall by the wayside. So you are welcome to think about any innovation in your professional life or in your personal life. Here's some different words. Close your eyes for a second and just imagine some of the news stories, the videos, the pictures you see. Very, very focused on the gadget, on the app, on the thing. What I have come to appreciate, and I realize it about myself, but I think it's on all of us, none of us are immune to this. Like, we all have the shiny object syndrome. We see the cool new thing, we focus on it, and it honestly takes a lot of focus, a lot of discipline, and a lot of effort to say, okay, that is interesting, but to widen your gaze and think holistically, to think systematically about what does an actual implementation plan look like? How would we integrate this? Is the solution acceptable to all stakeholders? Can you even name all the stakeholders? What are the realistic costs? What are the realistic outcomes? What about change management? Is the solution sustainable? And when I reflect on my own work, so I'm a biomechanical engineer, and I've spent a lot of my career thinking about devices. How do we design them? How do we get them to assist? How do we get them to be comfortable? Are they easy to use? What's the right feature set for the right type of end user? And don't get me wrong, this is super important work. This is what we as engineers need to be focused on, but it's only a small part of the picture. And what I've grown to appreciate is all of us need to be spending as much or more time focused on all the other implementation steps if something is actually going to have a sustained beneficial impact. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about education and hype. We've all seen the hype train in action. This example is a recent one. It might be a little too fresh for some people. Out of curiosity, anyone buy the Humane AI pin? Okay. Either know one or not willing to admit it. Well, I was going to apologize for those who had. For those that don't know what this is, okay, so the Humane AI pin was meant to be a revolutionary smart accessory. The idea was, instead of all of us reaching for our phone 100 times a day and interacting with our phone, you would instead have this little magnetized pin that sat on your lapel, and you could press the button, you could talk to it, you could query ChatGPT, you could search the internet. It had a little projector so you could interact on your hand instead of your phone. It was meant to revolutionize the way all of us interact with the internet, interact with our phones, interact with each other. Okay? Lots of hype. It had all the buzzwords. Hundreds of millions of dollars raised in venture capital, and then they launched the product. So they launched the product in April of last year, April of 2024, to a less than spectacular reception by users. Tons of hype, but when it got in people's hands, a very prolific tech reviewer who had reviewed over 1,600 products described it as the worst product he had ever reviewed. And this was pretty much the sentiment that was felt. The hype was high, but it fell way short once it got into people's hands. So this product launched in April of 2024. Within 10 months, the product was discontinued. The company was sold for pennies on the dollar to HP to work on other types of technologies. And as of 2.5 weeks ago, they shut down the servers, so even if you have one of these pins, it doesn't do anything. Okay. That is the perils of overhyping something. Okay? Now, if we turn back to ergonomics, I am quite certain that if I polled this room, we would have a lot of opinions, on what you feel is overhyped. For some people, it's back belts from 30 years ago, overpromised and underdelivered. For other people, standing desks are getting too much hype around them. For others, it's any one or more of the new innovations that are slowly maturing within the realm of safety and ergonomics. But what I want to emphasize is that hype is not about these technologies. Hype is about how we communicate these technologies. And every single one of us has a choice. We have a choice on how we talk about them, what we amplify, what we project about them, and how we respond when we hear things that we think are misleading or BS. And sometimes we have to call those out and talk candidly about things. So the hype is a choice that we can all help have an effect on, really through education. So for me, the education of new innovations has two parts. One, education is hard with new innovations. We don't have the answers. None of us do. That's the nature of something new. So it requires this kind of build, measure, learn cycle where building is either products or building tests, learning from them, making measurements, learning from them, and then doing that repeatedly, hopefully across multiple sites until you've aggregated and accumulated enough evidence to be able to say, okay, we confidently know certain things. Next, it's about communicating candidly, the good and the bad, the knowns and the unknowns, and to communicate to all the different stakeholders. And there are different people that need to understand different parts of new innovations. I have seen organizations implement this kind of education principle really, really well, across the board, really trying to understand what is known, communicating it well to each different stakeholder group. And I have seen implementations and education where at almost every level there was misinformation and it was a disaster. It's often a big difference between success and failure. Clear, candid communication ends up being one of the keys to sustainably implementing new innovations. Okay, two quick bonus tips, and then I'm gonna finish up here. The first is, I recognize that if you are on the receiving end of a new innovation, you're receiving information about it, it's hard to sort through what is evidence-based and real and what is myth and conjecture. And so one framework that I have found to be helpful is this Karl Sagan's baloney detection kit. This is easily findable online, but it's a good framework for critical thinking, for the types of questions you can ask, to help sort through when you're seeing a new innovation, what is likely to be true and what is likely to be, at best, wishful thinking. Second bit of advice, and this is really just to avoid any unpleasant surprises, is to be honest with yourself. Be honest and candid about whether you or whether your organization has a true appetite for innovation. Okay? Do you need to be successful immediately? Is it okay to fail forward and to learn? And if it's not, it's okay to keep track of innovations and to bide your time and to make your moves when the timing is right. None of us can be innovators in everything. In my personal life, there are some things I'm very innovative on, and there are some things where I am a complete laggard, as my kids often remind me. Okay? So be honest, be realistic about your true appetite for innovation. Oh, yes, the elephant in the room. So I want to address, you all have been very polite, you've been very kind, but even having attended this conference one time, I know full well you are not here for this talk. So thank you for sitting through it, but you are here to catch up with your Ergo colleagues, and you're here to see the Ergo Cup, right? The gem of the conference. So I wanted to close out by giving a big shout out to the Ergo Cup folks, everyone that's participating, innovating, coming here and sharing it with us. And as I was putting this talk together, it really crystallized for me just how well Ergo Cup exemplifies innovation. I had the chance to go through a few of the booths yesterday, and you don't show up, they don't hit you with a name. They start by telling you the problem that they were addressing. They talk about the capabilities, and they talk about their solutions. There's people, there's objects involved, there's processes. It's not a simple gadget or shiny object. They talk you through the solution, the sustainability of it. Then they measure outcomes in terms of operational impacts, in terms of safety impacts, and then we are lucky that they come here and share that with us. So, one of my closing pieces of advice is, if you want to learn about innovation, get off your phone, stop reading those articles about innovation, and just go talk to more of the Ergo Cup folks. That is true innovation in action. As a formal closeout, and I I shared with you a framework that I have found helpful of the kind of the do's and don'ts, but it's kind of a lot to remember. And I have found that if I can give a smaller piece of actionable advice that's sometimes a little bit easier to send you off with. One thing I have personally found to be very helpful, and I think might be helpful for you as well, is when faced with a new innovation, if you force yourself, old school, get a pen and a piece of paper and write down the actual capabilities and the expected outcomes. It has often helped me see an innovation for what it truly is. I have also learned that when giving a presentation, if I summarize my advice in limerick poem form, you are more likely to remember it. So, when you see something cool and you're starting to drool, get over the name, avoid the hype game, write capabilities and outcomes in full. Thank you all for your time and attention. I hope you have a wonderful conference.